D.K. Clark has become a very dear friend here, to everyone here in the museum. He lives in Lansing, but he makes that trip pretty regularly, and he comes, and we appreciate him on so many levels. Here is this one of the most outstanding military strategists in U.S. military history, and he's our friend, and he comes to take our trash out during our events. And that tells you so many things about who this man is. He's been working on this presentation on Jack Stillwell, who's so closely tied to the history of Fort Wallace. We're looking forward to what you have to say, DK, and welcome.
Thank you. As this is coming up, like I said, when I dedicated the library, I got started on this guy, Comanche Jack, and some of the famous stories about him. He was at Beecher's Island. He was one of the youngest people there. He wound up taking over because the guy who was supposedly in charge was Sharp Grover, who was, in my terminology, a coward, and he hid. And so when it was time to find a volunteer to walk back from Beecher's Island up in Colorado to this site, actually 2 miles further, the guy who walked out was Jack Stillwell and Pierre Trudeau. 2 of them walked to save the command a month after his 18th birthday. And then next night, people tried to get out, couldn't, and Jack Donovan and his best friend, H.A. Pliley, who is in the National Guard, Kansas National Guard Hall of Fame, if you don't know that, walked out and then got the stage, and actually were going to catch the stage, and then linked up with Carpenter, was released. So that's where I got started on this guy. And then I found out, began to do more research and learn more about him, and I realized in talking to Deb that right after dinner, Marla is going to talk about women on the trail, and I asked to talk about men on the Santa Fe Trail. And I'm going to take you on an adventure that I hope nests well with what Frank said and what Mike had said in a much shorter time frame. And I hope you find this interesting. So here's Simpson Everett Jack Stillwell. In a book published by William Bell on that's called New Tracks, who did the survey. He was the physician at the survey party with General Palmer for this railroad track. And he recorded, and he had an individual with him who was doing the woodcut craft. They passed some of the ox trails on the Santa Fe Trail. I want you to look at this thing. These wagons are carrying 8,000 pounds. Those teams then, I'll show you how many oxen to hold that wagon and how many boys were guiding those oxen. And I was shocked, and it's an interesting story. That's crossing the Arkansas River, an eyewitness account in 1867. A little bit about Jack. His family called him Everett. And we'll get to where Comanche Jack came from. I think the Jack came from, hey Jack, but anyway. His dad's from Alabama, a carpenter. His mom, you can read, Charlotte, is from Indiana. What this will blend into is a family that's an abolitionist family. Jack is the oldest. He has a brother, Frank. Now what I'll tell you about Frank, and kind of involves in the story, as good as Everett is, Frank leads a life of crime, and he's killed, I think it was Wyatt Earp, is killed by Wyatt Earp, and later in life, and I'll talk about it a little bit briefly, Everett goes down to kill Wyatt Earp and finds out what Frank had did, and he winds up being Everett winds up moving to Arizona as a result. There's his brothers and his 2 sisters, and when they were born, Hebrew Institute lasted less than a year in Baldwin City. You can see where they were. It was actually a little school down in Prairie City, which is on the southwest end of Baldwin City. He attended a prep school for a few months at the old castle. Now, the old castle, and I'll show you a picture when it was built. The old castle, anybody familiar with the old castle at Baker University? Anybody here? I'll show you some of it. When Everett was 8 years old, he quarried the stone for that 3-story building. A little bit more about of Everett. Told you his dad was a carpenter. There was an accident. His wife was helping him, and she received an injury that left her essentially deaf and loss of balance for the rest of her life, and very debilitating injury. So to come up to help again with the family and the growing family, initially it's her niece and then her sister will live in this growing family. They move, you can see, from Westport to Palmyra. Now Palmyra is part of Baldwin City. It's on the northeast side, and I'll show you where it's at. And I like to think of Palmyra as the Las Vegas of the Santa Fe Trail. As bad as those end-of-trail towns, they didn't hold a candle to Palmyra. Because every few months, the end of the trail moved and had rebuilt. Palmyra is still there. Palmyra was known by the number of saloons, gambling joints, and the ladies of the trail. And you'll see why they were there. So his wife finds out, comes home one day, and finds Jenny Price in her bed, and finds out about Mary Brady and Jane Grace here, who were other two consorts with William, and kicks him out. There's a divorce, and this divorce is filed 3 times, and it didn't get finalized until 1863. But what happens in that settlement is that William gets custody of Everett, Howard, and Millard. Okay? These two. Apparently Frank's already off on his life of crime, but anyway. As Howard and Millard go with Dad and his consort, they wind up in St. Joe, Missouri. And Everett is supposed to be with them. But it doesn't happen that way. And I'll get to that part in a minute. This is what's called the Old Castle. There was an early professor, and he said to protect himself for the students, he would hole up in the castle. But this is in Baldwin City. It's right on the edge of Baker campus. It's kind of hard to read. It was built in 1853. I want you to look at that stone. That was quarried by an 8-year-old, 9-year-old Everett Comanche Jack. This is the Stillwell home place, and I'll show you on a map where that is. It was north of Prairie City, west of Palmyra. Out behind the home place, you see this sort of ridge line. There's a creek that runs back there, and you never turn an old cavalry scout loose, unaccompanied, unescorted, because they might find the stone quarry of the stone used for that 3-story building, and the foundation of the house and the cistern I was able to find. Talk a little bit about Palmyra. My dig at the Santa Fe Trail, it doesn't tell me how many saloons or how many gambling joints, but on any given day, on a wagon train on the Santa Fe Trail, passing through Palmyra, is 80 wagons, 350 men. And they come there, and there's a tiny well at the edge of town. Look, if you can read this, it's 2.5 feet in diameter. It's only 56 feet deep, but the water goes to 17 feet. They were able to water on a daily basis over 2,200 oxen, 1,200 mules, refill all the water containers on those 80 wagons, and allow these 350 men to take a bath every day. Plus, it was a water place for the town of Palmyra, okay? Now, kind of talking about that, 80 wagons, and this is Bell's recording over here in the vicinity, again, surveying this railroad between Hayes and Pier, in addition to having been delayed for 10 hours to allow the buffalo to pass. But on one of the crossing sites, going to Dodge, 80 wagons, 8,000 pounds, 10 yoke of, that means there's 20 oxen per wagon, 3 bull whackers. Typically it was a Spanish guy in the front, and in the middle, on the other side, and then in the back were 2 boys that helped move each wagon. To cross each stream, they would have to double up. So they cross a wagon with 2 sets of oxen, go back and pull the others. And they're sitting there watching this. So each of these trains that they observed, Bell in this 1867, 350 men, 2,200 oxen, and it was 3 miles long. I didn't have a vision that's what was passing down the Santa Fe Trail when I started this research. 30 football fields. So this is Baldwin City. This area here is known as Palmyra. This region off here that's Prairie City. You can hear me? That is the home place for the Stillwells. It was right here, right at the edge, just north of Prairie City. That's why he could go to school at Prairie City. Can you hear me okay in the back? So he could go to school here. One morning, oh, this is the castle right here. I think some folks visited the ruts next to Blackjack Battlefield earlier. There was a ceremony down there, Deb Goodrich and so forth. That's here, that's how close it is. But one morning, as was typical, Jack leaves the home place, which he does every morning, with 4 buckets. He's 13 years old. And he's lost. The oldest sister goes to the well and finds the 4 empty buckets. Where's Jack? Well, 3 months later, they find out that Jack has joined the Santa Fe Trail as a freighter. He's known as SE. If you go into archives and try to find Jack Stillwell, he's not there. He's SE Stillwell. He's also Simpson E. Where Giles came from, I still haven't been able to figure out, but buddies called him Giles. So in certain records you find Giles. Hey Jack, I will tell you why he's called Comanche Jack. I had never heard Wildcat Stillwell. I'll finish up the story of the Comanche Jack. He lived with the Comanche in Arizona in the winter. He eventually learned 7 different Indian languages in addition to Spanish. The Comanche called him the whirlwind of the prairies. He just kind of sweeps in and he goes on, and he was adopted by the Comanches. Each time he goes through here, it's like a family reunion when he can find the Comanches. 1863, again he goes to the well and doesn't return. Now where do we get this story? Let me flip back over so I get to the right. And it's interesting, I think, how this story all came together. His youngest sister was Elizabeth in Stillwell when she married Cooley. She told the story to her grandchildren about Jack going to the well. One of the grandchildren recorded it and then had the story and about all this. Now Jack also worked in this piece with his freighter. I think it's an interesting story of grandparents educating their grandchildren, otherwise from journals and notes, we would never know about this portion of the story. Here's a kid that's 13 years old, and he begins the journey till he's 16, 7 trips on the Cimarron and the mountain route. And he became known as an expert on both routes. You can see time frame, starting in 63 to 66, 67. And he learned Navajo, Comanche, Kiowa, with winter in New Mexico. I think we said Arizona, but I meant New Mexico. Charles Rayburn decides, using a survey like Foster, a 200-mile cutoff, okay, using the Pawnee Trail. And I'll show you that the Pawnee Trail. The Crooked Creek branch of the Santa Fe Trail is what it was called in 64. And the Palo Duro, and I'll show you what those trails are. And those were considered branches of Santa Fe Trail, and they both cross about 2 miles east of Fort Dodge. It's not the Mulberry crossing, it's a separate crossing. 15-year-old Jack was put in charge then of hauling 3 loads of cornmeal. The first wagon set, he's the lead guy, only had 500,000 pounds of cornmeal. Why? You might know a guy by the name of Kit Carson. And he had surrounded and had control of 7,000 Navajo down on the Bascarando. The problem was, Kit Carson tried to teach them agriculture, and it failed both years. These were starving. Remember where Jack's been spending his winters? Down in the same area. And so he is selected then by Rayburn, who has the contract to use Foster's route and then to feed those people. So he goes down all the way to Fort Sumner and then to Bascom and back. He makes that trip 3 times. The first time was 500,000, but that's only half the contract. The next 2 times, as they're offloading grain in Westport, and we talked about that port there that Frank did, we talked about that. So they only had the 500,000, and then the second shipment was 250, and then the third shipment was 250, 1 million pounds of cornmeal to feed the Navajo. So, I don't have to tell you a whole lot. Santa Fe Trail, by the way, this is Baldwin City, Palmyra, hauling down, and the wet route and the dry route, the Fort Dodge, the mountain route, and the Cimarron route. And this route cut off Fort Dodge here and went south of Mulberry. It was on the west side of Mulberry Creek, and it was known as the Pawnee Trail. There are 3 Spanish military. This is not Spanish military, it's Spanish trail. It's like trying to back up a bus on a 1-lane road. So he was on both the Crooked Creek and the Palo Duro. When this thing pulls out before we go to the next one, we'll go stop this. Okay, look. I do want to back up now. I want you to just back up one little piece. I'll delete the last 3 slides of all the questions. In March 64, this road was found to be 200 miles shorter to go this way. Okay. Again, those are the 2 routes. And I'll talk about, this is the primary route that the military would take, Crooked Creek. And we'll link this to an event that happened right out here, not too far from here. Remember the German family? Many of you know the German family? We know from Arlene's map, this was a military regularly used route, but if adverse weather attacks, they would go a little further to the Palo Duro. This Palo Duro route takes you right to Adobe Wall. And so when the German daughters, the girls, were taken, Arlene's map shows they went down the Palo Duro. Now, how do you know where it's there? Massive ruts, all these Spanish wagons, and I can still see it. Matter of fact, I saw the trail 2 days ago. I'll see if I can go forward. Now this trail is a little bit older than the other. Coronado, the original trail of this piece of Santa Fe is 1541. Now in 1541, when the crossing, you see here, up here at Dodge City, they went to the Quivira, is where he went, which is between Lindstrom and Lyons, Kansas. And he went up there. He was disappointed not finding the 7 cities of gold, but he was looking for this modern civilization. He went through over 30 villages up in there, and he called them the Quiviras. The Quiviras, you know, as the Pawnee. These are the ancestors of the Pawnee, and they moved further north. So this route from Coronado from 1541 is all the way up to Salina. Now this road will be extended over the next 265 years to a place called Guide Rock, Nebraska, where the Pawnee are at. The Pawnee have left the Salina area and moved up into the Guide Rock. Now we're going to jump ahead 265 years, and so the commander in Chihuahua sends Malgares to intercept Lewis and Clark. Why Lewis and Clark? Because the Spanish believed that the north portion of their land extended to the Platte River. Remember, the United States bought the Louisiana Purchase? So they didn't, in Spanish eyes, they didn't own that. Spanish military were continuing to go all the way to Guide Rock and had these roads. Here's the Smoky Hill River, would take down. On their crossing was just west of Mulberry Creek, and that's the Coronado Crossing Pawnee Trail. This is also known as the Pawnee Trail. This is Pike. And again, we're talking about 1806, travel on this route. Malgares, you can see what he had. It was the largest military force Spanish ever put out. He went up to make sure the Pawnee attacked Lewis and Clark, or capture them, and to repel any future American expeditions. So Malgares returned in October. Well, shortly after Malgares, there's some guy called Zebulon Pike, and you can see Zebulon Pike and his route, and he goes up and he convinces the Pawnee that they don't need to listen to Malgares because he has no authority, but me. But as he leaves there, he realizes he's angered the Pawnee. So what Malgares does, in his route going south, in each of the camps, these dates, trying to maintain distance so he doesn't run into Malgares, Zebulon Pike follows Malgares all the way down to Dodge City. And then he takes what we now would consider the mountain route, and he's rested down in Santa Fe. So this route is known. I mean, it's 1806. If you have the Zebulon Pike's expedition notes, this is all clearly documented and how clear the roads are and the routes. You can see indicated, the S are all the Spanish camps where they would routinely camp. So this is a well-known route. So this is the route then that is known or suspected that all this freight's going to pass down to Fort Baskin. But at that time they called this the Pawnee Trail, but if you got down to Dodge it was called the Palo Duro or the Crooked Creek of the Santa Fe Trail. Now, where's the crossing site? 50, Fort Dodge, I think it's what, it's about 6 miles to Dodge City. Here's Fort Dodge, you head to Fort Dodge. This is the Arkansas River. If you've ever been there, there's Coronado's Cross. Anybody been there, seen Coronado's Cross? Some of you have? Okay, this is Highway 171, which is known as either 171 if you have a GPS, but if you look, check on the maps, it's called Coronado Road. I want to focus your attention right here. There's Coronado's cross. At the base of that cross is the dedication of the cross, and when it happened, on June 29th, 1541. When they crossed. It's right there on the base of the cross. You've been there, but there's the dating on it. And again, I think it was interesting because of that high holy day, because Coronado was Catholic, dedicated that crossing site to St. Peter and St. Paul. And again, here's a crossing. This is out of Kansas State Historical Society. It was in the Harper's Monthly. You know where this train came from, most likely? Fort Leavenworth. How do I know it's from Fort Leavenworth? There's a couple of clues. Fort Leavenworth. Kind of hard to tell, but if you look clearly right up here, there are 4 mules and a lighter wagon, and the guy's riding with the whip. And so the most of the cargoes coming out of Fort Leavenworth were a much smaller wagon than the freighter wagons. One guy riding, not 10 yoke of oxen. And this was most likely a Fort Leavenworth detachment that maintained this traffic. You remember those swells you just saw? Let me back up and see the swells. See the islands and the swells? And then crossing up through here. This is what it looked like. Wednesday. I guess it was Wednesday. This is what it looked like on Wednesday. There's the entrance of the trail, and it wove around through here and exited. And when it exits, you can see the trail, and there's heavy tracks that goes right down the edge of that guy's cornfield. You drive about 5 miles south on a hardball road, you can see the tracks to your left and right. Well, you could on Wednesday. So, can you see that indentation? That's the crossing site. There's the trail. There's the hardball I was telling you about. And there's the ruts on both sides of it. You see? There it goes. Oh, let me back up. And there's the route. The oldest section of the Santa Fe Trail, I would guess. 1541. We'll plead our case out in the parking lot. What I will point out from this route that Jack is taking and leading these wagons on, he takes the Crooked Creek route from Fort Dodge, past Adobe Walls, to Fort Bascom to feed 7,000 Navajo at Fort Sumner. This is the area that he would winter over when he was one of the bullwhackers on the Santa Fe Trail. He knew these people. Brought down here back to Bascom and then back up Crooked Creek. If you have the Moccasin Speaks and you look at the map that Arlene drew in there, you'll see from Adobe Walls that they came down through the panhandles on the Palo Duro route. By the way, this is also known as the Panhandle portion of the Santa Fe Trail because it went through the panhandle of Oklahoma as well as Texas. Tell me this wasn't fun. This is just kind of shows you some of the posts. I'll point them out here, locations. Up here is Dodge. Up here is Fort Dodge. Up there in here is Santa Fe. And then M in here is Fort Sill, Oklahoma. K is Camp Supply, and that's some of the Custer, but these are some of the places that still will be. This area here was the Llano Estacado, and then to the edge of it was Kit Carson on Bastard Condo, where the Navajo were kept. And this is a official survey. It was published in 1868. Henry Jackson of the 7th Cav survey drew this. It says in March of 68 and it was published. And this is in Sheridan's Report of the Post. And it shows Fort Dodge, and the crossings down in here, talks about the land and so forth. So this, you've got a copy of all my slides.
No, I'm going to sign through the back.
So I'm gonna go with Jack as a scout and guide. Okay, his last return trip was 67, so how old was he? He was 17. March 21st, he becomes a day laborer. Look what he's doing. When he's 8 years old, he's quarried for a 3-story building in the cistern, and so anything for a job. So he's there, and we'll kind of run through. Now, Major Henry Douglas hires him at Fort Dodge to go out to be a scout. While he's out, there's firing and shooting on people at the Cimarron crossing, and he leads the relief column. You might remember at this same time frame going on as the Asiatic cholera struck and some issues out there. Okay, about a month later, the 18th Kansas is formed at Fort Harker. Because of the cholera, it moves to Fort Larned, and again, because of the Asiatic cholera, which I believe they realized was being carried by the Mexican or Spanish folks on the Santa Fe Trail hauling cargo across the post. Went on to Fort Dodge, and then he becomes a guide for the 18th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry. But on the books, he is a scout at Fort Dodge, and that becomes important here now. He comes on to Hayes, meets A.J. Pliley, and they're friends for life. So now, we've had a lot of conversations about the Battle of Prairie Dog Creek, and the name I've never heard in Prairie Dog Creek is Jack Stillwell, who is the guide for Armis and the 10th and the Buffalo Soldiers. Why? Because he was not part of the 10th Cavalry, but this starts a role where he spends the rest of his time as a scout and guide with the Buffalo Soldiers, which I think is an interesting story. But he is and he's the scout and the guide at Prairie Dog Creek, and he's not mentioned in any references other than entered on the rolls, and there's some letters later that he was the guide at Prairie Dog Creek. And then goes with Elliott, begins his association with 7th Cav. Okay. Now here's the next twist. 18th Kansas goes back to Larned, and then Jack goes back to being the guide, and he's guiding all of the supplies that Thomas Murphy, Superintendent of Indian, to the Medicine Lodge Treaty, and he's responsible for guiding all the cargo down there. Who else is at the Medicine Lodge Treaty Series? He was only there for a short period of time. His image is in this museum. Roman nose. So at Beecher's Island, here's somebody else that may very well have been familiar with Roman nose, is Comanche Jack, who's the scout who's been delivering the supplies down there during the Medicine Lodge Treaty. I don't know that for certain, but knowing his temperament and his notoriety on the prairie, I would be surprised that he didn't know Roman nose. And yet, all the claims that nobody at Beecher Island knew who Roman nose was. One of the 50 Fearless, and we'll go through this quick because I've... So, he enrolled at Harker to Hayes, to Wallace. They departed on the 10th, of course, because of the attack on the wagon trains over here at Sheridan. And again, Eli Ziegler is younger than Jack, so Jack, I think, is the second youngest guy out here. Arikara, this would never have happened if Medicine Bill had been leading. Sharp Grover is following the Brule into that canyon instead of turning right and going down the Arikara to where the Cheyenne, who did the depredations on the train at Sheridan, they turned right, went down the Arikara because that's where they camped. The Brule were over on Bonnie Reservoir. So they go into this encampment. Their first attack is 6:30 the next morning. At midnight, again, the guy that should be going out is the guy who's paid as the top scout. It's Sharp Grover, but it winds up being Comanche Jack Pierre Trudeau on the 17th. 2 nights later, Jack Domino and Pliley go out to get the help, to get to Cheyenne Wells, and they run into Carpenter, Lieutenant Carpenter, that's in that vicinity. So he leaves at midnight on the 17th. He's here by the 22nd. Stilwell and Trudeau, 9 hours. Here at Fort Wallace, he reports to Bankhead, and within 9 hours, he's back in the saddle, leading Bankhead back to Beecher's Island. That's the Roman nose, by the way, and the killing of Roman nose. And I suspect, known as the best shot, perhaps, except for Barney Day, was Jack Stillwell, and where all the Native American reports where Roman nose was shot is where Stillwell and 2 others were past the position, because we know he was shot in the back. He just passed position. There were only 3 people in that position. One of them was Comanche Jack. He doesn't end there. Look at him. The 4 guys that went out joined Papoon's scouts. Returns to Hayes, rolls with the 7th Cav. George takes him as a guide. That's not going to last very long, because on July the 4th, he took out for a buffalo hunt. He takes Libby and Annie Roberts, who later becomes Annie Yates, on a buffalo hunt. And Annie Roberts, later, and that's where George Yates met her, by the way. Annie Roberts shoots the buffalo so much better than George Custer that he didn't record the results of this thing, and Annie has to leave the company of Libby or no more hunts, which is hilarious. He's a post guide at Fort Sill, joins the 10th, and I'll just kind of run through the rest of this kind of quick. There's the second battle of there. Jack rides for that. From the Darlington Agency, he rides to Fort Sill, and in the Red River War, he rides 70 miles with 1 break to change horses over the 5th and 6th of July. He's again out with the 10th Cavalry in the Red River War. Then the next year, he goes out and convinces the last of the Comanches to surrender. 1 guy goes out and Comanches them and leads them back in. Then he's with Mackenzie. And he becomes an interpreter in Texas and Arizona. He's in Texas for 2 years. He finds out Frank has been killed by Wyatt Earp. He goes to Arizona to kill Wyatt Earp, and then he winds up being an interpreter for the Native American tribes then in Arizona for 2 years. That's what he looks like in 76, okay? He's how old? 26. He's Bill, remember, born in 50. And with Jones, that they're out in here, and this is in 76, so this is when he's with Mackenzie. And this is when he reaches Tombstone. He's lost some hair and some weight, and but there he is in 1880, I believe, in Arizona. So his last scout was in January, and he goes and he is a cowboy for a while, riding the line, becomes a deputy U.S. Marshal. He decides when he's a marshal he's going to go to law school, so he graduates from law school in 92 and becomes a judge. To 95 for 3 years, then he becomes a federal commissioner. This is all down in Arizona and Oklahoma. Actually, he's a cowboy in Oklahoma, and this stuff all winds up being back down in Arizona and Oklahoma. And his old buddy, his old friend, Buffalo Bill Cody, is forming a new town in 1895. And so in this conversation, Buffalo Bill gets Comanche Jack to join him in the emerging town of Cody, but he has to make a stop first. And he's there with Buffalo Bill until February 1903. His stop had to do with this British lady that he met in the East, Esther. And this is in 95 to get married, so that tells you he's 45 and she's 22. But he marries Esther, and they come to Cody, and he dies then in 03. When he's buried, and I'll show you where he's buried, Esther waited 2 years and she remarried this guy named Hammett, but then when she died, she goes back to be with Jack. So, Old Cowtown, anybody been up there? I know some folks been up to Old Cowtown. And who, if you've been up there, do you remember who this guy is? How about Robert Redford played him in a movie? That is John Johnson, who became Jeremiah Johnson, and that's also known as Liver Eating Johnson because his wife was a flathead. She was killed by crow, and to atone for his wife's death, he killed 300 crow and ate their livers. Next to him in Cowtown is, and let me flip over to my notes because I'm right at the very end to get this, to make sure I got the guy's right name, but I believe it's Jim Jones. I'll check. So, this is Jim White. Anybody ever heard of Jim White? Jim White was the boss buffalo hunter on the plains. He had the records of more than 16,000 buffalo kills. And he kept track of each one. And he shot all of them with a .50 caliber sharps. So there's Liver Eating Johnson, and there is Jim White. On the far left, see that short stone? Recognize that picture? Jack Stillwell. So there's Jack Stillwell. So he's in Old Cowtown, and I've been to Cody so many times and never went up there. But his body was exhumed down on the river. And he and his wife were buried on the river, and they exhumed in 1984. They exhumed these three guys from where they were and moved them up to Cowtown. And so since '84, Jack's been up here, and his wife is down in Cody on the river. That's Comanche Jack. I hope I've exposed you to another story of the Santa Fe Trail that predated by over 200 years, a Spanish road, the Pawnee Road, and it figures in the history here. And I'm just amazed at Comanche Jack Stillwell. So, have I overstayed my welcome? No. If you have questions, mail them to Chang. or if I ever give the Beecher Island presentation again, Melinda and I have had chats. I think I'm done. I think with Beecher Island and with Jack Stillwell, I don't know that I could do another presentation on a subject as this. It takes too much time as you get in your 70s to research into the detail. But this has been a true joy. It really has. So if you have questions, we're going to be eating and shortly, I think. It should be about that time, I think. Now, after that, we're going to come back. Marla Matkin is going to talk about the women. And hopefully it's not the women of Palmyra, but one never knows with Marla. By the way, in that castle that I told you about, the stone castle, they have the keys to the rooms of one of the saloon's finer clientele who stayed there. Those keys are in the that castle place, which is a museum, which is wonderful stores. You get the floor.
Well, here, DK, just wait a second.
Now, I have a problem. I've given you every coin we've got. So I'm out of coins. Wait a minute.
How about I came up with a solution?
No, you came up with a solution. So here, I'll hold it up.
Okay, so what this
Ann,
is,
can you come help me?
my aunt, I talked to her about making quilts.
Get on the
On the microphone?
yeah. I'll hold it. Pam's gonna hold it. Pam's gonna hold it.
Okay.
Yeah, right here.
So I talked to my aunt, we like our veterans and we want to support them, and we did this, we kind of got the idea from Quilts of Valor, but this isn't a Quilt of Valor, it's a service quilt, and we sure thank you for the service. And I guess a lot of you went home last night and you said you like the bandana material. This one had the most of the bandana material in it I could find. So there you go. Thank you for your service.
get it if I kneel?
Get up.
If it clicks, it's a titanium knee.
Okay.
We're so fortunate to have so many wonderful experts that share with us, and it's so accessible to those of us that aren't experts, and it really means a lot. DK is one of the best, so we just appreciate it. So. I believe supper is at 5:30. Does anybody know anything different? Okay, we're still on for 5:30 chuck wagon. So, you're just to, if you don't have you're going to take care of things at the beginning of the line for the chuck wagon. And you feel free, I don't know how much we're going to set up inside, and I don't know what it feels like outside. We still have seating outside, but you can come in and just find a place to plant, just wherever you want to be. I hadn't just thought about this till right now. I tell you what, Marla's presentation is back in here, and we will draw for the raffle right after Marla's presentation right here. All right? That sound good? All right, any other thoughts? Oh, right after this, Peggy asked for everyone involved with the library dedication to meet in front of the library for a formal portrait. Okay? Anything else? All right, give it up for Chance over here with the IT. Okay, enjoy supper, and we'll see you back here at, I believe, 6:30. Is that correct?
Yeah.
For Marla's presentation, Women Along the Santa Fe Trail. Not the Smoky Hill, Women Along the Santa Fe Trail.